It began on a quiet night, inside the nation's most prestigious museum. Guards discovered priceless sculptures missing, frames left hauntingly empty. Detectives moved quickly, but the nation froze when surveillance footage showed nothing. The cameras had been cut at the exact moment of the theft. Then, investigators uncovered something chilling. A hidden message carved into the glass of a display case, a taunt left behind by the thieves. An anonymous tip pushed the investigation across borders, pointing to an international smuggling ring. A daring sting operation recovered part of the stolen collection, but just as hope returned, one suspect slipped away into the shadows, the eye. Media erupted, questions swirled, and the nation held its breath. What if the missing pieces never came back? And who was the ghostly figure that vanished without a trace?
Like the video and share it with your friends. Subscribe to our channel for daily crime cases we uncover. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update.
It began on a quiet night inside the nation's most prestigious museum. The marble floors glistened under the dim glow of security lights, their reflections broken only by the faint footsteps of guards making their routine rounds. For decades, this building had stood as a fortress of culture, a place where history and beauty were locked safely behind thick walls. That illusion shattered in a single night, when an audacious crime shook the country to its core. The first sign of trouble was not the sound of breaking glass or the screech of an alarm. It was silence, unnatural, heavy, almost suffocating. The guards entered Gallery 4 and froze in disbelief. The sculptures that once dominated the hall were gone, their pedestals stripped bare. The frames that once cradled priceless sketches by masters of a forgotten era hung hauntingly empty, nails bent and fibers torn where canvases had been ripped away. The scene felt less like a theft and more like a desecration, as if ghosts had slipped through walls and stolen the soul of the museum. Panic spread quickly. Radios crackled with urgent voices, alarms belatedly triggered, and red warning lights washed across the marble halls. Yet the response came too late. Whatever had happened inside the museum, it had unfolded with flawless precision. When detectives arrived within the hour, they faced not chaos, but eerie stillness, as if the thieves had vanished into thin air. At first, investigators turned to the surveillance system, expecting a clear picture of the culprits. But what they found deepened the mystery. Every camera in the affected galleries had gone dark at the exact same moment. 2:13 a.m. No static, no tampering caught on tape. Just a sudden blackout, as if someone had flipped a hidden switch. It was too coordinated, too perfect, and far too professional to be dismissed as coincidence. One detective leaned closer to the security monitors, studying the frozen timestamps. The lights above buzzed faintly, casting long shadows across the control room. On the desk lay a small folder. Inside, the last maintenance logs of the camera system. What caught the eye wasn't the dates, but a tiny symbol scribbled in the tarsum corner of the page. A triangle intersected by two lines, carved in pen, its meaning unclear. It was the first clue, though its true significance would only reveal itself much later. As the investigation unfolded, something even more disturbing surfaced. Inside one of the empty glass display cases, where a sculpture once stood, detectives noticed a faint marking on the surface. When a flashlight beam struck it, words emerged, carved roughly into the glass as though etched in haste but meant to be discovered. It read, "You cannot guard what was never yours." The phrase chilled every investigator in the room. It was not just theft. It was a message, a taunt left behind for the entire nation to see. By morning, news of the heist dominated every channel. Journalists crowded the museum steps, their cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward officials who had no answers. Headlines screamed of betrayal, failure, and a cultural wound inflicted on the heart of the nation. Families watched in disbelief from their living rooms, their children asking how something so precious could simply vanish. The museum itself transformed overnight from a place of admiration to a crime scene under siege. Yellow tape cut across its grand staircases, officers posted at every corner, and forensic teams dusting for prints beneath vaulted ceilings. Yet for all the activity, the evidence remained maddeningly sparse. No fingerprints, no footprints, no signs of forced entry. Whoever orchestrated the heist knew every inch of the building. They moved like shadows, leaving nothing but the mocking words behind. Detectives pressed deeper, combing through records of former employees and contractors who once had access to the security system. A dozen names surfaced, but none stood out, least not at first. In the meantime, whispers began to circulate of foreign collectors with deep pockets, figures in the underworld willing to pay fortunes for art that could never be displayed publicly. The investigation stretched beyond the museum's walls and into the international black market, but the first steps were slow and uncertain. Still, investigators clung to the message etched in glass. Forensic specialists examined it under magnification, noting that the grooves were uneven, suggesting it had been scratched quickly with a metal object. The angle indicated someone tall, standing upright, confident enough to linger even while committing the crime. That detail sparked debate. Was this arrogance, or a deliberate distraction meant to pull detectives down the wrong path? The lead investigator filed every detail meticulously into a thick folder marked Operation Silent Gallery. Inside were photographs of the empty frames, close-ups of the carved message, and a copy of the maintenance logs with the strange symbol. Each page added to the puzzle, yet none provided the missing picture. The file became the anchor of the entire case, a growing testament to a crime that refused to yield its secrets. As hours turned into days, the pressure mounted. Officials demanded answers. The public demanded justice. And within the museum's shattered silence, the investigation team felt the weight of a nation on their shoulders. They knew this was no ordinary heist. It was a statement, carefully planned, flawlessly executed, and terrifying in its scope. Then came the first glimmer of a lead. Late one night, as detectives reviewed hours of city surveillance footage from the streets surrounding the museum, a pattern emerged. 3 vans had circled the block repeatedly in the hours before the cameras went dark. Each time their plates were obscured by mud, their windows tinted, but their timing too precise to ignore. One van lingered near a service entrance shortly before the blackout. And then, just like the museum's cameras, it disappeared from view. The team worked tirelessly, tracing possible routes, comparing traffic footage from nearby intersections, and pulling city toll records. Yet the trail grew cold quickly. Whoever drove those vans knew how to disappear in an urban maze. But one sharp-eyed analyst noticed something the others had missed. A faint reflection on the side of the van as it passed beneath a streetlight. When enhanced, the reflection revealed the same triangular symbol seen on the maintenance log. It was the first real connection between the museum's interior and the world outside. A thread linking the crime scene to the shadowy network beyond. But it also raised a terrifying question. How deep did this symbol run, and who was behind it? Detectives felt the ground shifting beneath them. This was no longer just a theft. It was a message, a challenge, a declaration of power. They could sense the scale widening, and with it, the danger closing in. And then, just as hope flickered, in the form of this new clue, disaster struck. When the team rushed to pull additional footage from the city's servers, they found the files missing. Not corrupted, not erased, but deliberately wiped clean as if someone had known exactly where. Investigators would look. The digital trail had been cut with surgical precision, leaving nothing but empty directories. The folder marked Operation Silent Gallery remained open on the table, photographs scattered, evidence stacked high. Yet without the missing footage, the fragile thread connecting the crime to the outside world was severed. Detectives stared at one another, realizing they were not the only ones watching. Someone else was one step ahead, erasing traces, manipulating shadows. The nation waited for answers. The investigators pressed on. But the question that froze everyone was simple. Who had stolen not only the art, but now the very evidence that could lead to justice? The second day began not with sirens, but with light sliding across a table of photographs. The images were arranged like tiles, each one a fragment of a larger puzzle that refused to resolve. A gloved hand moved one photo an inch to the left, and another a fraction to the right. Lines of tape marked angles. Small arrows in ink marked scratches no one else had noticed. The carved message on the display case held the room like a held breath. Under magnification, the etching revealed scooped edges that suggested a hurried hand, but an experienced one. The pressure varied across the strokes in a rhythm that looked almost practiced. Along the lower right corner rested a faint halo of residue. It caught the light in a way only a trained eye would register. Someone had placed a small adhesive patch there and then removed it. The shape was not random. The oval arc matched a known type of micro-recorder mount used by contractors who disappear after a job. The discovery pulled the case away from ghosts and toward method. It meant a hand had lingered beside the case longer than the guard logs suggested. They logged the residue sample and slid a new photo into the grid. It showed the service corridor floor beneath a bank of disabled cameras. The tile grout seemed ordinary at first. Then a technician angled a portable light, and a faint smear awakened, a crescent line of compound that lived between dust and gloss. It was sealant, not spilled at random. It dabbed over a hidden junction box plate that should have been flush. Someone sealed a fresh cut. Someone had been below the surface. They lifted the plate and found an inline bypass installed with clean discipline. Thin wires in neat colors. Heat shrink, tidy, and smoke-free. No rough cuts, no tool chatter. Everything about it suggested a professional who treated the museum like a studio where silence and time were the only true currency. The ore bypass sat on foam to reduce vibration noise. That small courtesy said more than any bold signature could ever say. They bagged the device and set it beside the anchor file. The folder had grown thick and heavy. It had a new divider labeled Glass Evidence and another labeled Corridor Splice. A third divider awaited a name they did not yet have. Paperweight against anxiety. Paperweight against a vanishing trail. Then the pattern surfaced again. The triangular symbol in pen from the maintenance logs returned in the metal itself. On the underside of the junction plate, a fine scratch sat where no one would normally look. 3 strokes intersected in a mark too careful to be accidental. It felt less like vanity and more like a quiet flag for those who could see. The symbol traveled with the work. It moved across mediums. It gave them a thread. They pulled supplier records for everything in the bypass and filtered by lead times, distributors, and purchase patterns. The colors of the wire sleeves matched a small batch ordering style used by a handful of boutique electronics brokers that specialized in custom kits. A list narrowed from hundreds to a dozen to 3. Only one had made a shipment to a city within a day of the heist. The invoice did not point directly to a person. It pointed to a shell client and a drop point near the river where the city forgets its own name by the water. At the drop point they found nothing except impressions in dust and a rectangle of clean concrete like a ghost crate had once sat there. The detective in charge knelt and watched the angles of tire tracks fade toward a loading lane. The pattern of tread fit a common panel van. That did not help until the back edge of the clean rectangle offered a sliver of paper. It had been shaved thin by movement and trapped beneath weight. They teased it free with the edge of a knife. The fragment was from a shipping seal. The backing glue smelled faintly like pine solvent. A corner of black ink remained. It showed the lower half of the triangular mark. They brought the fragment back, scanned it, and overlaid it with the photograph of the symbol from the junction plate. The slope matched. The ratio of stroke to negative space matched. It was not proof in court. It was proof of persistence. The same hand, the same quiet flag. the same belief that erasure could be graceful. Then came the problem that had closed the first day. City traffic footage that had captured the vans was gone. Not corrupted, not broken, gone. The team refused to accept a smooth void. They looked for the edges of the void instead. Logs were read, access times were rebuilt, routine backups were tested. A quiet technician found a half-second anomaly on a maintenance server that was not part of the official chain. It mirrored a sliver of footage as a diagnostic heartbeat. It was meant for engineers. It was not meant for detectives. The sliver was not motion. It was a checksum block that indicated frames had once existed. That meant a copy could exist somewhere else. A contracted archivist mentioned an off-site compliance backup held by a third party for regulatory audits. Nobody thought to ask them because audits sit far from the crime of a night. They called. The backup windows did not align perfectly. They overlapped just enough to matter. From that off-site backup, they recovered 2 still frames burned by compression and time. In the first, a van nose entered a pool of light and a side panel glinted. The reflection echoed the triangular mark, less like a logo and more like a sticker placed at a particular height. In the second, the van had passed. The light showed a scrap of plastic fluttering at the rear door latch. A field tech knew the part. It was a throwaway clip used to keep a latch from fully engaging during repeated loading runs. Faster than a clean open, riskier than a proper latch. It made sense for a hurried crew with rhythm. The stills went on the wall and the room became a map of glints and ghosts. They built a timeline with the precision of a well-paced metronome. The bypass installed before midnight. The cameras silenced after. The carved message made during the window between the final guard sweep and the false lull that followed. The vans arrived then left in a stagger that suggested staging rather than panic. The delay between the first and the last meant someone had parked long enough to receive weight. Art does not fold. Art takes space. The crate size implied a sculpture and 2 frames at least. A separate team canvassed the river warehouses that rented by the week. Names were mud. Paperwork was missed. One manager recalled a unit that was paid in advance by a woman with a voice that did not match the address she wrote down. The memory was not proof. The detail hung in air like a loose thread waiting for a hook. Forensic analysts returned from the lab with news from the adhesive residue on the display case. The chemical profile fit a mount used not only for recorders but also for contact sensors. The presence of a trace alloy suggested a small device with a metal backplate. That meant the thieves may have carried their own micro-alarm system to track patrol timing within the museum. It was not only about silence, it was about awareness. Their own map overlaid on the museum map. They then returned to the museum power logs. A dip in draw occurred for less than a breath, near the time the cameras died. It was too short to trip the generators and too long to be noise. It suggested a deliberate mod that rerouted load through an unmonitored loop. The bypass from the E corridor work only made sense in concert with another cut. They were missing a second entry point. Something near the roof, perhaps. Something behind a service stair that looked like a dead end to anyone who did not draw that building for a living. Field sweep found scuff marks on the inside riser of a stair no guest would use. The marks were fine and regular and aligned with the height of a crate edge. They built a small model of the stairway with tape on the floor and practiced the clearance angles using mock crates. The only way to clear the final turn without scraping plaster would be to tilt a crate to a precise degree and to have a second handler counterbalance with quiet strength at a particular point. That degree and point were not random. They were trained. They spoke with a former contractor who had built traveling exhibits. He described crews that move with ballet discipline and how certain outfits within the gray market poach those skills for darker work. He mentioned a network that hides behind restoration firms and shipping consultancies. Names are masks. Contracts are smoke. Money speaks through goods that never appear on a gallery wall again. He had heard the triangular mark called the silent apex by those who whisper at loading bays after nightfall. It was a suggestion rather than a certainty. It gave the detectives a label to test. While the teams chased structure, the lead investigator returned to the carved message. They decided to read it as an inversion rather than a taunt. "You cannot guard what was never yours," read as a principle behind a theft that styled itself as a reclamation. That opened doors into collector circles, where ideology dresses as taste. It also opened a practical route. Ideology leaves a trail of writing. Writing leaves a trail of paper. Paper leaves a trail of names that most thieves forget to disguise when they stop performing and begin living. They scraped social spaces for phrases that echoed the tone of the message and crossed those against the silent apex label. A handful of accounts surfaced. They spoke about art as if ownership were a joke and guardianship a lie. Most were noise. One account used a rare spelling variant in a phrase that matched an inscription on a crate label photographed years ago in a different seizure case. The seizure was small and almost forgotten. It had held a broken frame and a slip of paper with that same triangular mark in pencil. They pulled the old box from storage. Inside lay a photo of a hand wearing a pale work glove with green stitching along the wrist. That stitch style belonged to a discontinued line purchased heavily by a restoration company that went bankrupt and then reappeared under a new name, across the river. That new name leased a warehouse with newly sealed windows. The sealant brand matched the corridor splice at the museum. The glue smelled like pine again when they walked the alley. The windows looked blind and tired. The metal door wore a fresh coat of dark paint that reflected no light. An evidence ribbon of red tape stretched across the entrance after they obtained a warrant that lived and breathed on the strength of fragments aligned into form. They entered slow and counted their breaths. The air inside held cold and dust. Shapes stood under canvas like sleeping giants. Each shape could be a ladder, or a broken shelf, or a crate big enough to cradle a sculpture the country had once adored in daylight. The team moved with care. The lead investigator went for the office nook and found a desk with nothing on it but an empty frame face down. The backboard had scratch marks near the clip posts as if someone had swapped contents in a hurry. Beneath, the frame lay a folder. It contained a single photograph, printed in matte. The image showed a crate with the triangular mark and a handwritten number code. The code matched a catalog entry from the museum. Someone wanted them to see this. Someone wanted them to know the scope. They kept moving and cataloged the shapes beneath the canvas. Several were decoys made of scrap wood. One was a generator. Another was a box of straps and dolly wheels. At the far end of the warehouse, a cooler sat on a pallet. It hummed like a patient heart. They lifted the lid and found within a lab-grade cold pack and a foam cradle. The cradle wore indentations that matched the base of a small bronze. The bronze was not present. The absence felt colder than the pack. A sound rolled across the metal ceiling. Not wind. A low mechanical shiver like a service elevator somewhere nearby taking a load it did not want. The team froze. The sound faded and left the warehouse in hollow quiet. On the office shelf, a light blinked once. It was the small face of a motion alert hub without its paired sensors. The thieves had taken the eyes, but left the mouth. The hub had logged motion in the last hour. That meant someone else had been here very recently. Footprints in the dust near the side exit confirmed it. The prints were neat and shallow, like the step of someone trained to land weight without noise. A thin sliver of green thread lay at the threshold. It matched the glove stitch from the old photo. The thread felt like a taunt and a trail at the same time. They swept the outer wall and found a fresh set of tire impressions pressed deep into damp soil. The tread matched a panel van again, but this time the spacing told a newer story. 1. Tire was underinflated. That could slow a fast escape if luck met resolve. The investigator clocked the lane and the likely outbound route. River Road to the freight spur to the port. The port held a maze of containers and a forest of cranes that turned names into numbers and numbers into silence. Then a Small vibrations skittered across the desktop. A burner phone hidden under a blotter woke, flashed with a single unknown number, and fell still. No ring, no voice, only the evidence of intention. The team stared at the dead screen and listened. To the warehouse breathe. Somewhere beyond the thin metal skin of the walls, an engine turned over in the distance and then quieted. The investigator lifted the phone and felt a snug weight of tape on the back. Under the tape lay a second SIM with a hand-cut edge. That small imperfection was a signature in a world that pretends to be clean. They broke the phone open and found a cache of timestamps without content. The times aligned with the gaps in city footage from the night of the heist. The phone had been used as a silent marker to pace a route. It was the metronome the thieves trusted when all other clocks were lies. They bagged the phone, closed the folder with the matte photograph, and marked the positions of every canvas shape. The team prepared to exit and call the next move. The lights dimmed for a breath and returned. A breaker somewhere had shuddered and recovered. The cool air tasted like dust and metal. The red tape on the door fluttered in a draft that had no obvious source. From the alley came a single sound. A call tone chirped once from the dark and then cut. No message, no words, only the proof that someone watched their watchman. The investigator stepped toward the door, and the chirp came again, shorter this time, then nothing at all. They reached for the handle and felt cold steel. The draft thickened, and the distant engine turned over again, as if answering a question no one had asked. The team exchanged a look that did not need speech. They opened the door to the alley, and the warehouse lights died. He moved like a stagehand who had learned to vanish between cues, one green-stitched glove guiding his balance as he slid along the alley wall. The warehouse lights fell in a single sigh, and the suspect's outline blended with the metal seam of a service door that did not belong to the building on any official plan. The triangular mark winked from a small adhesive tab on his sleeve, dull and deliberate. He did not sprint. He counted heartbeats and kept his pace even, as if tempo itself could erase him. From a pocket, he drew a thin strip of tape already folded, along one edge for a quick pull. He smoothed it over a breaker box he had doctored hours earlier and tapped the housing once, a habit more than a need. He paused, listened for the ripple his action would cause, and let the silence confirm the reach of his preparation. He turned away then, trusting the darkness to do what his hands had wired into it, while the motion hub in the office blinked a single green eye that meant only this had happened now. Inside, flashlights cut narrow corridors through the black as the team set their bodies between evidence and night. The lead investigator kept one palm on the anchor folder, because paper steadies the mind when power wavers. The burner phone rode in a sealed bag beside the matte photograph. The folder felt heavier in the dark, and the weight of it held the room together. The fixed beam found the desk and the empty frame again, and for a breath the glass reflected a ghost corridor where no corridor existed. That false depth reminded them the suspect had been building illusions long before the cameras died. Someone kept the vortex of panic small. Someone said to breathe without words. The team counted to 5, and the small world steadied. They mapped the warehouse by sound and touch. Canvas brushed shoulders. Pallet wood complained softly. Somewhere a slow drip met concrete and made a metronome for nerves. The side exit gave a bitter draft that carried the scent of solvent and cold. That solvent had kissed shipping seals and glove cuffs, and it shepherded the team toward the alley without needing a sign. Out in the narrow lane, the night felt thinner, as if machinery had exhaled the heat of its work and left a nervous void behind. The tire impressions were fresher than before. Moisture had not yet pooled in their shallow grids. A single curl of green thread lay near a scuff where a heel had pivoted without slipping. The thread did not belong to the warehouse floor. It belonged to a glove that had been earning a legend in the case file. They ran the alley with measured care. Footfalls counted, angles chosen, doorways scanned for hinges that gleamed too clean. The lead investigator kept the folder tight under. An arm, The other hand drifted over walls, searching for recent scrapes along paint. The light caught a horizontal line on a dumpster that had been waxed by a crate edge. Height and angle matched the model the team had built on tape, back at base. Beyond the alley, the city opened its maze. Streetlights painted islands where visibility felt honest and then surrendered to long bays of shadow. The suspect loved those yields where light and dark agreed to trade favors. The team learned to love them less and to use them anyway. Marks underfoot thickened toward the river, where the air held iron and salt, and every machine wore a jacket of fine dust that remembered every touch. The suspect moved through security like water through a cloth that looked tight, but was not. A guard shack glowed a reliable yellow beyond the port fence, but the cameras that should have watched the fence line had been blinded with a lens balm that left no residue worth a charge. He pulled a folded pass from a lanyard that could pass a quick glance but not a careful one. Quick glances were the currency he understood. He showed the pass to no one, because no one looked at him at the right moment. He occupied the interval, between a nod and a blink. The port made a strange night music. Chains whispered against steel. A distant crane rehearsed a slow dance with a container. Radios murmured in the language of numbers that the suspect heard as topography more than instruction. He stepped along that sound map and came to a stack painted with diagonal streaks from last week's rain. He reached into the seam between two containers and pulled free a magnetized tag in the shape of a small triangle. He ran a thumb along its edge and kept moving, leaving nothing on the ground but a single short breath. The team reached the perimeter minutes later and tasted the fatigue of a place that never sleeps. They showed badges to tired eyes and entered, a world where everything heavy pretended to float. The lead investigator unrolled the folder on the hood of a pool car and anchored the corners with cold hands. A photo of the van, stills, went in the upper left. The burner phone timestamp list went in the upper right. A page for the triangle symbol occupied the center like a compass rose. They matched the times to crane assignments. They matched the glare patterns to lamp arrays. A runner pulled the shift roster for yard crews and found that a subset of operators had swapped shifts with improbable generosity. That kind of kindness is theater in a place like this. The investigator pinned the roster beneath a smaller sheet that held a fresh copy of the triangular mark drawn in pencil. The pencil line steadied the room again. Signals were thin, so they built a physical grid with tape in the dirt beside the car, a small stage for a large machine. Containers were represented by labeled cards. The suspected path snaked between them. The team rehearsed the corridor with their feet, and the pattern began to breathe under the learned weight of practice. A point on the grid drew the eye. A gap where a shortcut briefly became a straight line if one had the nerve and timing. They moved to that real gap and found a maintenance ladder folded and locked. The lock wore fresh tool scratches concealed beneath an intentional smear of grime that hide as a signature when patience and deceit collaborate. The ladder's hinge bore a smudge of pine solvent that mocked bigger questions with its small memories. The suspect had come this way and had smoothed the air behind him with quiet pride. Crane 42 groaned in the distance, and the number felt like a prophecy until the radio corrected it to Crane 6. The correction mattered because the sliver from the backup frames had caught a reflection that matched the lamp array near Crane 6 by height and spread. The team's angle shifted. Their feet found a new path, and the map on the hood lost a card as reality replaced rehearsal with steel. They watched the swing of a container as if it could confess. The paint wore old scars and new touch-ups. A corner casting showed a faint triangle of cleaner metal, the absence left by a magnet recently removed. The investigator photographed the casting and slid the print into the folder beside the earlier images. Evidence does not care about drama, but drama often cares about evidence, so the act felt like a promise to the night. The suspect kept his rhythm, passing through aisles that smelled of rubber and salt. He paused at a stack where a narrow service door lived in the shadow of a floodlight. He keyed the door with something that looked like a battered pass clipped to a coil. The door gave without protest because it had been taught to obey one voice, more than any other. He stepped into a stairwell that hummed with the ghost of nearby machinery and climbed with an economy that did not waste a single breath. Above him, the city looked different. The cranes were animals at rest, half dream and half work. The river made a silver band that gathered the weak light and stretched it thin. He set down a small canvas bag and took out a phone that was not a phone and a tag that was not a tag. He placed the triangle on the railing and tapped the device once. Somewhere below, a container's internal sensor would now report its location to a network that believed it was reading an inventory check. He closed the bag, touched the green stitch at his wrist, and let his fingers memorize the weave. The team reached the base of that stairwell and found the door still warm. They followed the hum up through concrete air that smelled like dust and old rain. The lead investigator kept a hand on the rail and felt a faint tremor that belonged to a device finding a frequency. The urge to move faster met the knowledge that speed without sense is a gift to a ghost. They paced the climb and measured each landing like a chessboard counted in reverse. At the top, a narrow catwalk ringed a cluster of lights. A small triangle magnet clung to the rail, where a hand would naturally rest after a climb. The magnet carried a single human print smeared by a glove that did not want to be forgotten and could not help leaving echoes. The investigator slid the magnet into a bag and felt the small snap of separation, the sound of one plan abandoning another. The bag's seal made a second sound, quiet and sufficient. Below, a container eased into place and turned with the slow grace of something that obeys heavy laws. The yard loudspeaker declared nothing of interest to the team, which made it important immediately. They watched a handler with a hood up guide the placement with small gestures. The handler's right wrist flashed a green seam when the sleeve slipped. The distance mangled detail, but the seam's rhythm matched the memory that had been following them since the museum. They closed distance through lanes of stacked steel that made wind from still air. Their steps built a cadence that made security, glance, and then assent. The handler finished a gesture and stepped away with a roll of the shoulder that said, "Careful fatigue." The team lost him once behind a stack and found him again in the shadow of a reefer unit that hummed like an overworked chorus. They shortened angles until the world narrowed to the space beside one white door. Anchor symbols gathered without invitation. A strip of red evidence tape lay loose on the ground as if a seal had been broken and discarded with courtesy. A glossy photo had been placed face up on a coil of rope. The photo showed the triangular mark stenciled on a crate lid with a catalog. Number in a hand they knew from an old seizure. A small folder leaned against the reefer control panel, empty, but for a sliver of matte paper that had been cut too short. The suspect had curated the moment the way a stagehand dresses a scene for the reveal that will not happen. Emotion flickered at the edge of vision, and the team wheeled too late to catch more than a shoulder, vanishing into a service corridor between stacks. The corridor kinked twice and made a T where visibility died. The lead investigator kept the folder tight and let a finger touch the red tape strip on the ground. The adhesive still held grit that had not settled, which meant the future of this minute was still being written near them. They entered the corridor and found a door where rail workers never went, mounted clean into a wall that wore the wrong paint. The lock had been scored for a bypass tool once, and then repaired so neatly that repair felt like original design. That lie was the suspect's voice made wood and steel. The investigator tried the handle, and the handle offered nothing honest. Crane horns sounded from far off, and the echo filled the corridor with a timing the suspect could predict from habit. The team spread along the wall and found a second seam, thinner than a knife line. It hit a small panel that opened with finger pressure and revealed not wires, but a folded note held under a transparent flap of tape. The tape wore dust and two clear fingerprints that belonged to a glove that wanted to be both seen and denied. The note held 3 words carved with a blunt tool into thick paper and then pressed flat. "Guard your mirrors." The words carried the same cadence as the glass etching at the museum. The team felt the instruction more than they understood it. They bagged the note and filmed the recess, and kept moving because time is the thief of every careful case when a living hand is 2 corners ahead. They exited into a thin yard where trailers made a canyon and diesel made a haze that felt like late afternoon trapped in a bottle. A panel van idled without lights beside a stack of pallets that knew too many stories. The rear door latch wore the same lazy clip as the van from the still frames. The underinflated tire left its confession in a shallow puddle. The team closed the distance and saw a shadow leave the driver door just as the cab light failed to engage because someone had told it never to betray. They were near enough to taste the moment when a form separated from a darker form. Then the eye. Darker form swallowed it back. The investigator lifted a hand that meant, "Wait, be ready, move on my count." The count never finished. A freight siren ripped a long ribbon of sound across the yard, and the van's engine answered with a surge that promised acceleration. The door thumped, and the lock took the clip like a handshake. The team lunged, and their hands caught metal that wanted to leave them. The van rocked and bit for traction. A glove print bloomed on the glass and slid out of reach like a phrase half remembered and then lost to morning. The investigator slammed a palm against the rear door and felt the geometry of the crate inside. Weight spoke through steel. Position spoke through balance. Someone was carrying part of the museum in a box that had stopped being art and had started being gravity. They gave chase. The yard widened and narrowed in alternating breaths that the van owned from practice. The suspect clipped a cone and missed a bollard by less than a hand's width. The lead investigator kept the folder braced against ribs under the jacket and did not let it bounce. The folder was the case, and this road was its argument. The radio gave them intersections as offerings, and the crane lights became a constellation that refused to stay in one sky. The van knifed through a service gate that no one had seen open in years. The gate obeyed a code the suspect had fed it, with a cheap keypad that wore a new face. The team hit the gate as it fell back into its habit of denial. They rounded the fence instead and found a cut path along a drainage run where wild grass tried to reclaim what had been borrowed. The van circled a stack and then vanished into the geometry of a temporary build site. Silence pooled. The diesel smear-thinned. A gull wrote a serif across the night, and the wind erased it. The investigator let the stillness stand and listened past it. A faint click came from the far side of a scaffold, followed by a whisper of tape tearing from metal. They moved toward the sound and found a crate sitting square on a dolly, centered with an elegance that felt like contempt. Red evidence tape sealed the lid in a perfect cross that had been cut and replaced in a way only a hand with time would attempt in flight. They cut the cross once more and lifted the lid. Foam embraced a negative shape that matched a sculpture base captured in a museum catalog long before this horror began. The foam was cold. The cold had structure. The structure said the absence had been recent and planned. In the hollow lay a single green-stitched glove folded with care and pinned by a small triangle magnet that held a square of glossy paper. The glossy square showed the investigative team from behind at the warehouse office earlier that night, framed by the empty frame on the desk. The angle belonged to a camera that had not been on their radar. The caption area was blank, but the edges glinted with specks of dust, as if the suspect had shaken the print dry and smiled at its clean corners. The investigator slipped the photo into the folder and felt the anchor change its gravity. The phone in the bag vibrated once without lighting. The motion hub at the warehouse, far behind them now, would have logged a new event. The van was gone. The container path had shifted. The suspect had taken a piece of their reflection and left them a posture to hold. The team stared at the crate, and the glove and the magnet, and every object looked back with a patience that felt like a dare. They closed the lid and stood in the scaffold shadow while the yard resumed its normal fiction. A crane turned and lowered a container that did not matter to anyone on the team and mattered to someone very far away. The lead investigator touched the red tape cross and thought of the glass etching. "You cannot guard what was never yours." The words returned with the slow inevitability of tide, But now they stood in a place where mirrors were being guarded or broken or both. A door on the scaffold tower clanged shut without warning, and a low generator coughed as if clearing its throat. The team turned as one toward a narrow stair that fed into darkness. The suspect was not visible. The handrail wore a faint sheen of pine. A card sat on the first step, face down, catching a thin ribbon of light. They lifted the card and found the triangle printed clean in black, centered like a compass needle that refused to point anywhere but inward. Under the card, the metal step, flexed slightly and locked with a sound that belonged to traps and patience. The stairwell lights fell away in a tired sigh, and a steel door at the top of the shaft slammed down and locked them inside the stairwell. The stairwell swallowed sound, the way a vault swallows breath. Concrete walls pressed inward, each surface painted in dull gray that reflected no light of its own. The team's flashlights carved narrow paths upward, only to meet the locked steel door that had slammed above them. Behind their boots, the way back had already closed with a heavy click. That sounded final. They were inside a trap, engineered not for speed but for patience, the kind of patience a professional builds into an exit strategy. The lead investigator steadied the folder against a knee while the beam traced every seam of the enclosure. The red evidence tape strip from the crate still clung to one pocket, a reminder that their adversary enjoyed mocking boundaries. The glove with its green stitch lay bagged inside, beside the glossy surveillance photograph that had shown their own backs inside the warehouse. Now, in this stairwell, the objects felt heavier. They were not just artifacts. They were weapons of narrative control. The suspect had turned every step of the investigation into a staged performance, and the investigators were trapped as unwilling actors on his stage. The stairwell air was metallic and faintly sour. A drip echoed somewhere above, falling at intervals too steady to be natural. They traced the sound and found a pipe seam along the wall that leaked in perfect rhythm. It was not water. The droplet crystallized on the floor into a chalky residue that suggested coolant from a portable refrigeration unit. That meant one of the stolen bronzes or paintings had passed through here in a container held cold against decay. The stairwell was not only a trap. It was a corridor of evidence. They pressed forward, mapping steps with care. The risers bore scuffs at the same height, as if a crate corner had been dragged up these stairs more than once. The pattern was uniform, not chaotic, meaning the movements were rehearsed and repeated. They photographed the scrapes and slid the images into the folder, their anchor against the suspect's attempt to erase. Every mark said the same thing. Someone had moved art through this very shaft, perhaps more than the team realized, perhaps longer than the headlines suggested. Halfway up the stairwell, a small metal panel broke the monotony. It sat flush with the wall, no bigger than a notebook. They pried it open and found a cavity lined with foam, empty except for a folded piece of paper taped to the back. The tape smelled faintly of pine solvent. The paper bore the triangular symbol again, drawn in thick black ink, and beneath it 3 numbers, 06 1442. The numbers aligned too neatly with the crane assignments the team had mapped earlier. The suspect had left coordinates, or perhaps warnings, hidden inside the very walls of his escape. It was another taunt, but it was also a breadcrumb, one that tied the stairwell to the wider choreography of the port. They bagged the note and pushed onward. The upper steel door refused to yield even to their tools. Its bolts had been reinforced with welds, freshly scored but solid. This was not an escape. It was a holding pen. The suspect had intended to control their timing, to keep them locked just long enough that something else could be moved while they stood waiting. The realization tightened every chest. The stolen art was in motion, and the investigators were not. Still, they searched, because searching is survival. At the lowest landing, a hairline crack in the wall caught a beam. It was too regular to be natural. They pushed against it, and the panel shifted inward with a groan, revealing a narrow passage lined with raw plywood. The corridor was barely wide enough to walk single file, and the air smelled of sawdust and adhesive. This was no official structure. It was a tunnel built for smuggling, a hidden vein inside the skeleton of the port. The plywood walls bore scratches where heavy objects had brushed past. One side displayed faint red streaks of evidence tape that had been torn and stuck accidentally. Another bore a greasy handprint that matched the glove stitch pattern in reverse, the fabric having left its signature in oil. The team documented every mark, each one a confirmation that they were still on the trail, even inside this improvised labyrinth. The tunnel twisted and rose before emerging into a storage bay disguised as a maintenance room. Inside, the evidence thickened. A workbench held scattered tools, pliers, heat-shrink tubing, adhesive mounts. In the corner stood a stack of folders, thin, battered, and labeled only with numbers. The investigators opened the top one and froze. Inside were photographs of the museum itself, taken from angles no tourist would ever see. Back corridors, service elevators, restricted storage rooms. One photograph bore a handwritten note, "Time is silence." Another carried the triangular symbol stamped across the top right corner. The folders were proof that the heist had been planned for years, each detail studied until the building itself became a script. Among the papers, they found a smaller folder, and inside it, a photograph that did not belong to the museum at all. It showed a different gallery in a different city, across an ocean. The same symbol was scrawled on the reverse. This was no isolated crime. This was part of something wider, a network that treated national treasures as currency to be shuffled and traded in silence. The lead investigator placed the photograph into the anchor folder, the weight of revelation settling across the room. The nation had thought itself wounded by a single theft. The truth whispered of many. Then came the sound. A low rumble shook dust from the ceiling. The bay door rattled as if something heavy moved on the other side. The team drew close, bracing themselves, but when the sound ceased, the silence that followed was worse. On the workbench, a small portable radio crackled to life on its own. Static hissed, then resolved into a single phrase repeated in a distorted male voice. "Guard your mirrors." The same words from the note in the corridor. The radio hissed again, then died, leaving only the memory of that command. It was not a warning. It was a performance, a reminder that they were being watched even here. They swept the bay with urgency. Behind a rack of tools lay a metal case with a latch broken open. Inside, foam compartments showed negative spaces where small devices once rested. A single piece remained, a palm-sized recorder with a dead battery. When powered, it revealed hours of silence punctuated by fragments of guard conversations from the museum. The thieves had been inside long enough to map patrols, to memorize rhythms, to know precisely when the halls would be empty. The recorder was not evidence of a crime. It was evidence of surveillance so patient it felt inevitable. The realization struck hard. This heist had not begun on the night of the theft. It had begun months, perhaps years earlier, with cameras placed, schedules recorded, and vulnerabilities studied. The museum had been compromised long before the sculptures left their pedestals. And if that was true, then the theft of the art was only part of the plan. The real goal might still be in motion. The investigators bagged the recorder and the folders, adding them to their growing archive. The anchor folder thickened, its spine strained, as if the weight of the truth could not be contained. They knew the nation would demand answers, but they also knew the answers were not yet ready to be spoken. To speak them now would be to confess weakness, to admit that the heist was not just an isolated wound, but part of a spreading infection. The bay door rattled again, louder this time, and dust rained down in steady streams. The team braced as the steel began to lift, just an inch, then 2, then 3. Beyond the growing gap came the sound of an engine idling low, heavy, deliberate. Shadows shifted under the rising door, long shapes stretching across the floor. The investigators prepared to confront whoever stood beyond, their flashlights cutting into the opening, and then the power died once more. The motor stopped. The door froze halfway open. The only light came from the narrow shaft behind them. Through the gap in the floor, a gloved hand reached under the door and slid a new folder inside, pushing it gently until it rested at their feet. The hand withdrew without a word. The engine growled once, and then silence claimed the bay again. The folder lay unopened, its cover marked only with the triangular symbol in bold black ink. The investigators stared, knowing the next revelation. Waited within, knowing also that opening it might mean stepping deeper into a trap, designed not just to steal art, but to steal control of the story itself. They opened the folder on the concrete floor beneath the half-raised door and let the pages breathe in the thin light. The top sheet carried route sketches in sharp pencil, a lattice of arrows that ran from the port to inland freight yards and back again. A ledger followed, cramped handwriting listing crates by false catalog and by weight, with notations that matched the rhythms of cranes and yard crews already living inside their master file. At the bottom of the stack, a single photograph had been taped in place with a strip of red evidence tape. It showed a climate truck in plain livery, the kind used to move legal exhibits, waiting at a private loading lane behind a warehouse miles from the river. The photograph bore a faint impression at its edge, as if something heavy had rested there while ink dried. The impression formed that triangular symbol again, pressed rather than drawn this time, the way a seal leaves quiet authority after the pressure leaves. A last page, tucked inside a transparent sleeve, held a typed line about mirror sweeps and convoy spacing. The line sounded like instruction rather than philosophy, a practical reminder to watch reflections, to catch followers, to turn glass into warning. The phrase echoed the earlier message carved into glass and the paper note from the port corridor. The suspect did not repeat ideas for pleasure. He repeated them because they worked. They backed from the door and let it settle to the floor without touching the outside handle. The engine on the far side rolled away with slow confidence and faded into the layered murmur of the yard. The team gathered and moved down the narrow passage, retracing the plywood corridor and the stair, then emerging into the open lanes where the night carried the same iron and salt from earlier. The folder returned to its place under the lead, investigator's hand. It had grown into a portable archive that absorbed and steadied every surge of noise. Evidence can be cumbersome, but it can also be ballast. They built a response in minutes that had been rehearsed in theory for months. A call reached customs. A call reached port security. A quiet wave reached a federal task unit accustomed to moving without headlines. The climate truck in the photograph became a destination on a small map drawn with a blunt pencil over the hood of a car that still smelled of diesel. The team layered timings across the ledger columns and drew a path from the port to a set of inland lanes where concrete forgets. It was poured by hands, where private warehouses dress as empty night. At the warehouse district, shadows lay in rows like sleeping freight. Sodium lights threw pools the color of old paper. The investigators waited 2 blocks off the target lane and watched a mirror wired to a camera feed that showed the loading dock from a harmless angle. The truck rolled into frame with the same plain livery and the same deliberate pace as the high photograph. Its driver's seat wore a shape rather than a face, a posture that said the road was just a surface for a plan that had already chosen its outcome. They counted beats. One vehicle slid in behind the truck and then passed it without hesitation, a scout checking for tails on a tail. Another vehicle appeared in the far mirror and then vanished when a side street offered a clean edit. The lead investigator noted both movements on the folder edge with a brick of graphite, each arrow a small vow to keep rhythm honest. A third vehicle, a van with bland sides and tired paint, settled into the lane with no urgency at all. The convoy. Spacing in the typed instruction had been precise. It looked casual here because precision often looks like ease after practice. They brought the sting alive in a way that did not ripple. A loading bay 2 doors down from the target raised its door for a prearranged delivery that did not exist. A pallet jack scraped deliberately. A dock worker without a dock worker's calluses rolled a crate with red evidence tape crossed over its lid. A decoy shaped by careful hands from spare material and false weight. Inside sat a beacon, a nest of trackers, and a camera no bigger than a coin. The decoy would either be ignored as noise or adopted as comfort. Either way, it would speak. The plane truck backed into the target dock with a sigh of brakes and a whisper of rubber. For a handful of heartbeats, the lane held its breath. Then movement resumed in small, believable gestures. A side door opened, a ramp clinked into place, and a pair of handlers in clean jackets worked with ceremony that said they had nothing to hide. Their gloves flashed new, no green stitch visible, but the posture carried the same discipline. The suspect had more than one set of hands. The symbol on plans does not always sit on the wrist. They waited for a conviction that cannot be taught. A crane of a different sort, a forklift dressed to disappear, hummed at the corner and then drifted away. The handlers rolled a crate into the truck. The crate wore old museum stamps accented by fresh stickers that lied with confidence. The team recorded every movement, every mark, every pause. Patience is a blade in these moments. It is also a shield. A small call came through the quiet channel, a single syllable that meant, take the seam. The task unit sealed the ends of the lane without fanfare. More than one set of feet became part of the curb in the shadow. Someone knocked on a door farther down, a harmless neighborly sound that suggested nothing serious. Radios murmured in a language built from short nouns and quieter verbs. The team stepped in with care, and the handlers froze mid-roll, muscles taut by routine deciding whether to argue with training or surrender to force. The surrender came quickly, more relief than shock. Their jackets held no new keys, only pocket knives and lists of shifts. Their phones wore the dull hospital glow of devices that have been washed of memory. Inside the truck, the air cradled a steady hum that speaks of temperature kept honest. The team broke the seal on the first crate with a slow hand and raised the lid the way curators lift time. Foam lay sculpted around a negative space that matched a bronze listed in every front-page story of the week. Except the space was not negative. The bronze was there, bruised by travel but intact, its surface still wearing the film that specialists use to prevent sweat from becoming history. They drew breath, put name to metal, and let a small measure of hope settle across the room. The second crate held a frame wrapped in linen and stiff with age. The linen bore a museum code under old tape. The third revealed a smaller piece, less famous but dear to a school group who had stood around it years earlier and listened to a guide talk about hands and tools and patience. Recovery makes headlines smaller then bigger again. It also makes questions louder because a partial answer is an invitation. They resealed the crates with fresh red tape marked with date and time, then logged the handlers and their tools. In the cab, they found a printed route sheet with the triangle stamped at the top. The stamp connected warehouse to port, to ledger, to mirror, a line the lead investigator underlined twice with the side of a pencil lead. The folder swelled when the route sheet slid inside. The anchor grew heavier, the way a boat takes ballast, to cross rough water. Then came the expected pushback and the unexpected bend. The handlers asked for a name to call counsel and gave none. They asked to sit and then stayed standing. Their silence carried not threat, but training. In the pocket of one, a small tag shaped like the triangle appeared, clipped to a keyring that held no keys. Its edges were polished by worry or habit. The tag had a number scratched into it in a careful hand, not a serial, but a sequence. The sequence matched the crane assignment for a specific container already noted in their timeline. The suspect had built redundancy into his network and left small instructions to keep his orchestra playing if a section lost rhythm. They pressed the advantage. A call sent the container to a secondary inspection bridge with a routine excuse. Another call held it there with a scheduling story that neither offended nor convinced, simply existed until time passed. The team moved their operation to the port again, to a tower room that looked out over a grid of steel where every color of paint carries the same hunger. The folder lay open on a table that had once held coffee, and now held silence. They compared the scratched sequence to the active movement below and marked a path along the lanes of stacked rooms. A crane swung, and a container came to rest on. A chassis that should have left an hour earlier and did not. The driver for that chassis had changed twice, each swap papered by a friendly dispatch that wrote in the voice of routine. The second driver wore a hood, like the handler had worn a hood. Normal becomes costume after enough repetitions. The lead investigator allowed the chassis to move, then allowed it to stop at a waypoint during a lull that felt unplanned enough to send defenders to sleep. There, the unit met the law. Papers were perfect, tones were polite. The lock on the container was factory clean. They cut that lock like surgeons undo a stitch to reveal a wound. Inside, rows of cases sat in neat military posture. Some were decoys, empty and heavy with sand. Others were true, cold and tender to the touch. They opened one, then two, then three, and found work praised by generations watching from home, the nation quietly reclaiming breath it had held too long. The team called in conservators who moved with that reverent speed that professionals know, neither slow nor rushed, just precise. Relief is a dangerous chemical in an operation built on patience. It loosens knots, softens edges, makes a room feel larger than it is. The lead investigator felt it reach for the corners and kept the folder under one hand to keep the shape of the story intact. The driver remained a shadow near the scale house, until a murmur in his ear pitched his posture forward by a fraction. He reached for his pocket, then stopped, then turned, as if a whispered schedule just shortened by a breath. The team moved to intercept and found a clean face, a wallet with cards under different names, and a phone with only a clock and a compass. They turned back to the container and noticed a change so small it could have been imagined. A panel inside. The wall had slid backward by a finger width and then closed again, like a blink that came late. The air near the panel carried a whisper of pine. The lead investigator pressed, and the panel gave, revealing a cavity just deep enough for a packet and just wide enough for a hand. The packet contained a glossy photograph. It showed the recovered bronze sitting where it had sat moments earlier, but the timestamp along the bottom belonged to a camera that was not in the room. The photograph had been taken before the recovery began. Within the packet lay a second item, a small envelope that rasped when moved. Inside, a sliver of green, thread curled like a leaf in winter, paired with a triangular magnet thin as a coin. The arrangement made a message without words. The suspect had stood here when no one watched, had prepared this pocket with patience, had planned for the moment of relief to become the next moment of doubt. Mirrors are not only glass. They are also timing. They are also the habit of believing. You are alone when you are not. They logged the finds and sealed the panel again, unwilling to cast anger at a wall when anger would be stolen and turned into theater by their adversary. They sent the recovered pieces to a secure conservator route and watched the van doors close with ceremony that felt less like victory than like triage. Partial justice is still justice. It also writes a new appetite into the bones of a case. The need to finish songs that are not yet allowed to end. Night thinned toward a color that promises morning. The port lights blinked their slow eyelids, and cranes stretched like tired animals. The team moved their circle outward, sweeping for the triangle in places where honest light meets honest work. They found a maintenance badge tucked into a grate, 14 letters into a company name bent one short. They found a note scratched into paint that said only to guard mirrors and then smudged itself unreadable when a sleeve brushed it. They found nothing that could hold a hand. The green stitch man belonged to the hour between, to the breath that holds silence and builds plans from its echo. A final call came from the inland district, where the sting began. The decoy crate had been adopted, moved 2 doors over, then opened with care by hands they had not yet identified. The coin camera had seen a wrist with a small scar across the frame and a shadow of a shoulder with a posture already familiar. The footage showed a gloved hand lifting the decoy foam and pausing, then placing a small envelope under the foam before closing the lid with a courtesy that mocked the red tape cross. The envelope rode back to them inside the crate when the team retrieved it for analysis. They opened that envelope in the tower room with the cranes humming outside and the river pulling light across the surface. Inside, they found a single card, heavy as a key. The triangle stood in black at its center, perfectly centered and perfectly stubborn. The card felt colder than the room. It held a thin strip of metal along one edge, shaped to slide into a port on a device they had not yet seen. The lead investigator turned the card over once, then again, and saw a faint imprint whiten under lamp heat. The imprint formed 3 words in a hand they knew, written without flourish, written as a schedule rather than a taunt. The room held still as the words resolved. The schedule pointed not to the port or the inland warehouse, but to the museum itself, naming a service, entrance and a time not yet reached. The suspect had been moving forward while they moved outward, circling back to the place where the wound began, confident that their attention would be diluted by relief and scattered by the logistics of recovery. The team gathered the folder, and the card and the magnet and the green thread, and left the tower with steps that tried not to sound like urgency, even when urgency had settled into the bones. They reached the museum as pale light made marble remember its color. The grand steps stood quiet under a sky that had not decided if it would be clear. The building held its silence like a breath drawn hours ago and never released. The service entrance lay along a side street where vans wear uniforms and deliveries. Sound like patience. The lock on the door looked new. The jamb wore a thin smear of pine where a hand had steadied a body while turning a key that never should have existed. They entered the corridor that had once felt like a backstage known only to staff and thieves. Their flashlights returned to places that now knew their names. The carved message in glass waited 2 galleries away, still marked off by tape and watched by cameras that promised to stay awake. The service corridor held a new detail the eye might have missed if the folder had not taught it to see. A small panel near the floor sat proud of the wall by less than a finger width. It had been opened and closed by a hand that did not care to hide pride. They knelt and eased the panel aside and found a slot shaped precisely to the card the suspect had sent. The card slid in with a hush that felt like a decision. The wall answered with a low vibration, and somewhere a relay took the news and passed it along. The team stood and looked toward the gallery. A light hummed awake, then another, then a third, forming a path that had not existed a second before. Beyond the final pool of light, a shadow moved with the steady confidence of a man who knows a building better than those sworn to guard it, and a quiet door deeper in the museum clicked open on its own, inviting them to follow into a wing that was not on the public map. The hidden door yielded to the card with a soft click, and the museum breathed awake in a way that felt intentional rather than accidental. A line of lights marked a path through a service wing that did not exist on maps. Given to visitors or donors, the team moved as one body, and the folder rode tight against a ribcage like a heart that learned to read evidence. The corridor walls were painted the color of primer and carried no art. Cameras nested in corners wore new lenses that had never been logged. Floor scuffs drew a faint diagram at ankle height that matched crate widths and turning radii. Each mark said a crate had come this way before dawn more than once. Each mark said the heist was an echo rather than a first speech. The building itself had been folded to hide a second building inside it. They passed a locked door that hummed with cold. A notation plate sat beside it without a room number. The plate had been polished by fingers that needed it to gleam in darkness. The lead investigator touched the edge and felt pine solvent whisper through metal. That faint scent turned the night into a ledger again and left no room for wonder. At the end of the corridor, a small office opened like a throat. A metal desk faced a wall of cabinets with shallow drawers built to hold prints and plans. On the desk lay a single folder, prepared for a careful hand. Red evidence tape crossed its cover in a perfect X, and a triangle mark sat at the center, as if to bless the seal. They cut the tape and lifted the cover. Inside lay photographs taken from high corners in galleries the public knows by floor plans. and guided paths. The angles belonged to lenses placed before the heist and left to learn the loneliness of night. A second stack held purchase ledgers from a decade of minor repairs and consulting fees. Names repeated with the lazy rhythm of consent. One name belonged to a former curator who had resigned for health reasons and then reappeared abroad as a consultant no one could reach. The full circle tightened. The message carved into glass had not been philosophy alone. "You cannot guard what was never yours," spoke to a man who believed the museum had borrowed from the world and failed to pay interest in respect. The old curator had mapped the rot and sold access to the angles that rot prefers. The team read the ledger like a confession that refused to use the word guilty, yet could not bear the weight of innocent. They opened the shallow drawers. Inside the first lay a binder with plastic sleeves that held key cards old and new. The second held a batch of green-stitched gloves folded like uniforms for an invisible staff. The third held a set of triangular magnets with numbers that matched, crane assignments and container paths. The fourth held a stack of blank visitor badges with a template for names printed in pale gray to be filled by any hand with a steady wrist. They bagged the gloves and the magnets and the binder and the badges. The folder on the desk became heavier and steadier. The office door rattled against its hinges even though no wind blew. Somewhere in the wing a relay clicked, and the sound moved through drywall like a pulse that wanted to be heard. They turned down a second passage that sloped toward the earth and came to a steel door with a small window set at shoulder height. Frost laced the glass from the inside. The handle wore the brushed sheen of something held by hands that never shake. The lock surrendered to a card with the triangle stamped in black on its edge. Cold air rolled over them. The room inside was a vault without a bank. Racks held crates wrapped in gray linen and marked with codes that matched museum catalog numbers. A climate unit hummed like a distant choir. Along the back wall, a raised platform held 3 pedestals draped in black cloth and banded with red evidence tape. The tape carried dates that predated the heist by weeks. The timeline collapsed and reformed under a harder light. They lifted one cloth and found a bronze that belonged to a national story older than cement. They lifted a second and found a frame without a canvas. The absence shaped the space the way a voice shapes a room. They lifted the third and found a crate opened and closed so gently that the seal tape still whispered. Inside lay a matte photograph, showing the same vault from a higher angle, and a single handwritten line at the bottom that read, "Guard your mirrors in calm strokes." They looked up. A lens the size of a coin blinked red and went dark. Another lens winked from a corner where conduit met concrete. The vault had been watching itself, and that memory had been walking back out the hidden door each night. The suspect did not trust the world, yet trusted his own machines. That trust was a seam the team knew how to pry. They severed the recorder lines with a cutter that left clean ends for later analysis. They pulled power from the camera junction. The climate unit continued, unmoved on a separate circuit. They logged every crate and matched codes to the ledger. Some held gifts that were never meant to be gifts. Others held loan pieces that had never traveled beyond a press release. The vault was a shadow archive built by a curator who had decided that his private museum served a better truth. They heard movement above them, then a fading tread, then a soft clack at a door they had not yet opened. The team split in two and rose to meet the sound with caution, sharpened by grief. The lead investigator carried the folder down a narrow stair that returned them to the first corridor. The others moved along the outer ring that led to a service gallery behind the main hall. There a figure stood in the half-light between a case and a wall that did not cast a full shadow. The green-stitched glove rested against the glass like a calm hand on a sleeping shoulder. The man did not hurry. He adjusted a small device at the case corner that sent a signal up into the silence above them. His posture said he was at home. His focus belonged to an interior metronome set long before this night. The team tightened distance. The man lifted his hand from the glass and placed a triangular magnet on the case edge, as if signing a painting. He turned just enough for the mask of a hood to tilt into light. The seam flashed green. The nation had learned to fear that color without knowing it. The investigator held the folder close and counted the heartbeats between steps. The man did not run. He reached into a pocket and produced a card that matched the one that had opened the hidden door. He set the card on a plinth and stepped back. A relay clicked. Somewhere a lock released and a panel slid aside. Air moved like a breath taken by the building. The man watched the panel and then looked past the team at a distant point in the darkness, as if greeting a friend who had not yet arrived. They moved. Boots slid on polished stone. Gloves met cloth, and a shoulder turned hard. Then let go. The man yielded with the practiced ease of a handler, trained to fold rather than break. His other hand brushed the plinth, and the card tipped and fell under a pedestal lip. The wind of movement lifted a slip of paper from his sleeve and sent it traveling like a small white fish in a stream of light. They stabilized him with careful hands and searched the jacket. The pockets held a phone that showed only a compass and a clock. A key ring bore a triangle tag with a number that matched the vault platform. A blade carried the smell of pine along its handle. The man's mask revealed eyes as calm as a ledger. They found no wallet and no name. The name would have come later and would have been true enough to pass for a week. They retrieved the fallen card and the slip of paper. The card matched the format used in the hidden wing. The paper held 6 words written without haste. "Bring the ledger to the sea gate." The words bent the night toward the river again. The investigator pressed the folder flat against the plinth and felt how heavy paper can be when it holds a city. They moved the man through the service corridor and handed him to a team that knew how to keep muscle calm without bruises. The man looked at no one as he left, and yet seemed to hold the room in his gaze. That steady look did not raise fear. It raised clarity. He was not the composer. He was the first violin, and the score had more staves. They returned to the vault and finished the count. They recovered pieces that would make the nation breathe, better by morning. They logged damage where nails had been pulled and edges had been scuffed. They called in conservators who arrived with cases and lights, and the moral quiet that heals without speaking. The room that had been a wound began to remember itself as work. They also found a drawer hidden behind a false lip in the cabinet wall. It held a thin hard drive wrapped in cloth and secured with a strip of red evidence tape. The tape bore a date that matched the first rumors that a network existed at all. They placed the drive into a shielded bag and let the folder swallow a printed index that rode inside the cloth like a rib past skin. They called the port and the inland units. Warrants moved in the dark with a speed that required a straight spine. Names that had lived inside the ledger began to hear the knock that ends a season. A path across the river tightened like a net drawn by hands that learned patience from the case. The nation would not see the map. It would see the returns. It would see a museum that had been hurt and then had learned to hold itself upright again. The team stood under the rotunda as the sky traded dark for a thin blue without warmth. Marble returned to the color it shows in daylight. The carved message in the gallery remained under tape that warned the careless to keep distance. The words read differently now. "You cannot guard what was never yours" felt less like an accusation and more like the confession of a thief who had mistaken stewardship for theft. The building did not answer. Buildings never do. They moved toward the loading court to stage the recovered crates for secure transfer. A door that had never mattered before looked tired along its hinge. A maintenance badge hung from the handle on a bent clip and turned twice in a lazy circle. A note had been tucked under the hinge plate. The paper was coarse and carried grit, as if it had traveled in a pocket in which sand outnumbered coin. They opened the note and found a single line written in that calm hand. "Return what you cannot keep, and keep what you cannot replace." It felt like advice for a conservator, and a challenge for a thief, and a rule for a city trying to remember how to trust. They logged the note and let the folder rest atop the crate that held the bronze. News broke with the slow speed of early morning, and a nation learned to divide its fear between what had been taken and what had been found. Cameras waited at the base of the grand steps without shouts. The press line did not need words yet. It needed the sight of crates moving with care and of a door that had been closed waking to honest daylight. They loaded the pieces and sealed them with fresh red tape that glowed against grey wood. A conservator traced a fingertip above a label without touching the surface. The lead investigator watched the van door close and felt the folder lighter for the first time since the first hour. The ledger on the desk inside still waited for the Seagate. The drive still waited to speak. The man with the green stitch still waited for a room that does not give answers before it takes breaths. A radio on the hip of a quiet officer burred for a single beat and fell still. The sound was not urgent, and it was also not relaxed. The officer turned the dial a notch, and the channel whispered a traffic call that did not matter, and then a coordinate that did. The coordinate did not point to the port. It pointed to a decommissioned ferry slip on the river's far bend, where cranes do not reach, and fog learns to stay late. They drew a small circle on the folder's back cover and wrote the slip's name in pencil that smudged at the edges. They did not rush. They spoke to the museum director with care and placed a single page on a lectern that waited for a statement about recovery and patience, and the promises a city makes to its memory. Then they stepped into the cold that carries river air and let the morning open the way a door opens when you carry both keys and doubts. The ferry slip wore rust and silence. Pilings leaned as if remembering a storm. A narrow shack sat at the edge with a window that had not held glass in years. On the inside wall, a new sheet of clear plastic had been taped over a map in a cross of red that looked familiar. A magnet in the shape of a triangle held a single photo to the corner. The photo showed the museum steps at dawn, with the team in the middle distance. The angle belonged to a lens 50 yards away at second-floor height. They took the photo and scanned the shack. On the desk sat a phone without a battery and a card reader with a slot that matched the triangle card format. The reader blinked in a slow rhythm and then stopped. A small box under the desk wore a line of numbers that matched a container sequence already seized. The sequence had been placed where it could no longer hurt, and yet it had been placed here. Anyway, the suspect liked to build memorials to his own plans. They turned to the river. A low shape moved through the mist with the ease of a worker who knows every shallow and bend. The shape did not approach. It held position at a distance that promised sight, but refused detail. A single light blinked, once, and then held steady. On the slip's railing, a thin envelope had been taped where a hand could find it without eyes. They opened the envelope and found a card the size of a palm. The triangle sat at the center in black. On the reverse, AE line of type gave a date and an hour and a place that did not belong to water at all. The line named a gallery abroad where a sister piece to the recovered bronze had gone missing years ago and never returned. The hour lived 3 days in the future. The suspect was telling them the next measure in the score. He was also telling them that the concert had never been a solo. They looked up, and the shape on the water eased back into fog as if the river were a curtain. The phone in a bag on a belt vibrated once with no display and no sound. The museum behind them exhaled under a new sun. The crate with the bronze sat under a blanket of gray and waited for a door that would open to clean air and careful hands. They stood with the folder and the card and the photo and the note and felt the case resolve into a shape that could carry weight without breaking. Partial justice stood on the steps of a building that had learned new ways to count. Hope moved in the crates and in the ledger, and in the quiet faces of people who would gather at noon to see workers carry history with respect. And a camera hidden somewhere behind them clicked once and fell still.
What are your thoughts on this case? Let us know in the comments. Like the video and share it with your friends. Subscribe to our channel for daily crime cases we uncover. Turn on notifications so you never miss an update. Click here to watch the next video as we uncover another thrilling crime case.